In the spring of 2009, a county extension horticulturist named Dale Pruitt drove his white university truck up a rutted gravel lane in Calhoun County, West Virginia, and told Nora Vance that what remained of her mother's pear orchard was, in his professional estimation, a liability. He was 44 years old, held a master's degree in fruit science from Penn State, and he was not wrong that the trees were old. He was not wrong that most of them looked, to a trained eye calibrated on marketable yields, like a collection of crooked, fire-blighted sticks. He walked the 2-acre remnant in his clean rubber boots, tapped a few trunks with his knuckle, consulted his clipboard, and told Nora, who was 31 and had just buried her mother 6 weeks prior, that she was sitting on a boutique liability. That was his phrase. He said it twice. The orchard ran to roughly 43 producing trees and a handful of gnarled rootstock volunteers. He said she could probably clear the slope, run some grass, and get a feeder-calf rotation going. That would actually pencil out. He said it with genuine concern in his voice. Nora did not answer him for a long moment. She was looking at a particular tree near the upper fence line, a tree her mother had called the September Queen, which bore a long, russeted pear she had never seen catalogued anywhere. She said finally that she appreciated him coming out. Then she did not clear the slope. By the fall of 2023, 14 years later, Nora Vance had distributed just over 900 grafted cuttings from that orchard to orchards, university research stations, and small growers in 11 states. A pomologist from the USDA's Plant Genetic Resources Unit had driven 4 hours to sit in Nora's kitchen, taste pears for 3 hours, and describe 2 of her varieties as possibly the only living specimens of their type in the eastern United States. Nurseries that once moved 10,000 units of commercial varieties a year had reached out asking for grafting agreements she was not yet ready to sign. The September Queen was being evaluated for formal variety registration, and Dale Pruitt had quietly requested, through a mutual colleague, whether he might visit the orchard and learn what she had been doing. This is the story of the 14 years between those 2 visits, and what a woman who knew her mother's trees better than any spreadsheet could know them did with that knowledge, while the rest of the industry planted what the catalog said to plant. If you have driven that stretch of Calhoun County in autumn, you know what the ridge looks like in the 3rd week of September. The deciduous slopes in early gold, the creek bottom fog that burns off by 9 in the morning, the farmhouses set back from the road behind pastures that have been cut twice and are resting now toward a winter. The Vance place sits on 62 acres, of which perhaps 12 are tillable bottom, and the rest is slope and woodlot, and the 2-acre bench above the lane, where Ruth Vance had kept her pear orchard for 40 years. It does not look like much from the road. An old bank barn with a rusted tin roof, a farmhouse with a porch that had been refloored twice in the last decade, a lane that needed gravel, a working dog named Hatch, a big brindle mixed breed who spent his days following the perimeter of the fence, and his evenings at Nora's feet. When Dale Pruitt arrived that spring morning in his clean truck, Hatch watched him from the barn door with the flat, steady attention that working dogs reserve for strangers who have not yet been decided on. Let me tell you what Nora inherited from her mother, because without understanding the orchard's history, nothing that follows makes any sense. Ruth Vance had come to Calhoun County from the Virginia side of the mountains as a young bride in 1961. Ruth's own mother, a woman named Celia Alderman from Pendleton County, had sent her daughter west with a box of pear cuttings bundled in damp newspaper and tied with kitchen twine. The varieties in that box had no commercial names. They had family names, harvest time names, descriptive names that belonged to a single hollow in a single county and had never traveled farther. There was the September Queen, a late ripening russeted pear of dense, almost granular flesh that held sweetness past October. There was one the family called the Iron Pear, a small, hard, deep green fruit that most people would have called inedible in August, but that, left on the tree until the first frost kissed it, turned to a dense, spiced butter in the hand. There was a pale, elongated variety with a faint crimson blush that Ruth's family had always called the bridal pear, which ripened early and dropped fast and was good for exactly 8 days and no more. And there were others. Some reliable producers, some ancient volunteers that bore every third year on no schedule anyone had cracked. Ruth had grafted those cuttings onto seedling rootstock and tended them for 40 years in that 2-acre patch above the lane. She kept a composition notebook, and then another, and eventually 11 of them, one carrying into the next, filled across 4 decades with harvest dates, Brix readings taken with a handheld refractometer she had ordered from a catalog in 1979, notes on which trees bore heavy one year and rested the next, which ones responded to summer pruning and which ones punished it. She recorded the weather each October. She wrote down which neighbor's chickens she had let run the orchard floor after harvest and what she observed about codling moth the following spring. She was not a trained horticulturist. She was a woman who had tended the same trees for 4 decades and written down what she saw season by season in pencil on college-ruled paper. When Ruth died in January of 2009, she left Nora those 11 notebooks and a 2-acre orchard that had not been commercially managed in 15 years. Most of the trees still produced. Many were fire-blighted at the tips. 2 had bark canker. The grass between the rows was unmowed, and the old deer fencing had gaps. To a trained eye trained on commercial output, it did not look like an asset. That is what Dale Pruitt saw when he walked the orchard with his clipboard. What he did not see, what his training had not prepared him to look for, was 11 notebooks representing 4 decades of place-specific observation about varieties that existed nowhere in any commercial catalog, and what those notebooks might mean to someone who knew how to read them. Nora had grown up in that orchard. She was not a horticulturist. She worked as a licensed practical nurse at a hospital 40 minutes away and had been doing so for 8 years. She had no formal agricultural training and made no claim to any. What she had was the notebooks and the memory of a childhood spent learning tree by tree what her mother knew, and the specific refusal, in the weeks after the funeral, to believe that the knowledge in those notebooks was worth less than a feeder-calf rotation. She took a week of her bereavement leave and walked the orchard with the notebooks open, tree by tree, matching her mother's descriptions to what she saw. The September Queen had a canker on the lower left scaffold that Ruth had noted in 2004 and treated with copper paste. The canker had recurred. Nora cleaned it back to sound wood with a knife she had sterilized in rubbing alcohol, packed it with a clay and copper sulfate mixture she found in a note from Ruth, dated 2001, and moved to the next tree. She was not sure she was doing it right. She was doing what the notebook said to do. By the end of that week, she had walked every tree and made a list. Each entry carried the tree's rough condition, what Ruth had noted as its strongest and weakest years, and the Brix readings Ruth had recorded across her harvests. The Iron Pear consistently read between 18 and 22 Brix at first frost, which placed it above most commercial bosques at peak. The bridal pear was inconsistent, running from 14 to 19 depending on the summer. The September Queen was as reliable as any tree in the orchard, bearing heavy on the biennial schedule Ruth had mapped with accurate care, reading 16 to 18 bricks late in September when the fruit was right. Nora kept her nursing job. She worked the orchard evenings and most weekends from March through November. She did not scale down or sell. She did not hire a consultant. She bought a copy of a manual on heritage variety propagation that a small regional press had published in 1987 and read it until the binding cracked. She learned bench grafting from that book and from a retired orchardist named Earl Dodd in Wirt County who had grafted apples for 60 years and who agreed, after she drove out to meet him with a jar of September Queen preserves Ruth had put up in 2007, to show her the technique on a winter afternoon in his garage. Earl was 73 years old, lean and slightly stooped, with hands so practiced that the grafting knife moved through a cut in one continuous pull, without any visible decision behind it. He had 2 folding tables set up in the garage with rootstock lined in damp sawdust, and a bag of wax-coated rubber budding strips, and a coffee can of water for keeping the scion wood from drying. He showed the technique 3 times, slowly, and then handed Nora the knife. She made her first cut too hesitant, and the blade wandered. He said to let the knife do it, not to steer it. She made the next cut cleaner. He looked at the alignment of the cambium layers, the narrow green line under the cut surfaces where the living tissue had to meet, and adjusted the union slightly with 2 fingers and taped it off. He watched her first attempts without comment and said, after the 4th try, that she had the feel for it. Let me tell you what bench grafting is and why it matters to this story. Grafting is how orchardists reproduce trees that cannot be reliably grown from seed. A pear grown from a pip does not reproduce its parent's traits. Pear genetics are too heterozygous for that, and the seedling is a new individual, unpredictable, probably inferior. The only way to get another September Queen is to take a cutting, a scion, from the September Queen herself, and join it to a compatible rootstock using a technique that unites their cambium layers, the thin green tissue just under the bark where the tree's living cells divide and grow. The graft union, if it takes, produces a tree genetically identical to the parent. It requires sharp tools, clean cuts, proper alignment, and timing aligned with the moment just before the rootstock breaks dormancy. It is not complicated. It requires patience and precision, and the willingness to lose half your attempts while you are learning the feel of the cambium layer under the blade. Most importantly, it requires having the scion material to begin with. If a variety is lost, if the last tree dies, no graft can recover it. The living tree is the library, and the library is the only copy. Nora understood this the way her mother had understood it, without articulating it, intuitively, from proximity to the orchard over decades. She began grafting in the winter of 2010, her first winter with the technique. She lost more than half her attempts. Earl Dodd told her that was about right for a first winter. By 2012, she was running roughly 60% takes. By 2014, her rate was above 80%, which Earl said was as good as anyone he had known. She had begun to accumulate young trees, 2-year-old whips in 5-gallon buckets lined in the lean-to beside the barn, and Hatch had taken it upon himself to patrol the lean-to fence each morning, the way he patrolled the orchard fence, as if the young trees required his supervision. She did not know yet what to do with them. Meanwhile, if you drove 4 miles east on the state road that year, you came to the operation, run by a man named Gus Farrell, who had gone commercial with his family orchard in 2006. Gus was a practical man and a good farmer, and when the state extension program had advised him to convert his mixed heritage stand to high-density plantings of harrowsweet and moonglow on semi-dwarf rootstock. He had done exactly that. The economics made sense on paper. Dwarfing rootstock brought trees into production faster, high density per acre meant higher gross yield, and Harrow Sweet had the fire blight resistance scores that the extension charts showed in green. Gus had borrowed $82,000 over 7 years to buy the trees, install the trellis system, and put in a drip irrigation line. By 2012, he was showing good numbers, about 14 tons per acre in his peak blocks, which his buyer at a regional packing house was taking at 18 cents a pound. You could drive past Gus Farrell's orchard in August and see row after regular row of trained dwarf trees on wire, green and orderly, and think that was what a modern orchard looked like. Nora's orchard did not look modern. It looked like an old woman's orchard, which is what it was. The trees were full size and variable, and in some cases older than the farmhouse. The rows were not straight. A person unfamiliar with heritage orcharding would have walked those 2 acres in the company of a clipboard and seen, without difficulty, a boutique liability. If you have ever been around a region extension program, you know what the spring of 2013 looked like from Dale Pruitt's office. He had a territory of 11 counties. He had growers dealing with input costs, market access, blight resistance ratings, rootstock decisions, irrigation infrastructure. He had a budget and a mandate and a universe of data telling him what performed. Nora Vance's 2-acre collection of unregistered varieties on full-size rootstock was not a data point that appeared in that universe. He had made the reasonable call. He had made the call his training told him to make. He was not in contact with her again for years. Nora did not reach out to him. If there was a moment when things began to shift, it was in the winter of 2016, when Nora drove down to the Wirt County Orchardist meeting on a Tuesday evening and found herself sitting next to a woman named June Mast, who ran a small farm store and had been sourcing heritage apples for her preserves operation from a grower in Ohio who had recently cut his heritage lines. They talked for 3 hours after the meeting broke up. June tasted a jar of iron pear butter Nora had brought and was quiet for a long moment before asking where she could get more. Nora told her the quantity was small. June said she would take everything Nora could spare at $2.50 a half pint, which was 3 times the price of commercial fruit butter at the store. Nora did not change her operation because of that conversation. She sold June Mast what she had and went home and grafted that winter the way she had grafted every winter, without grand ambitions, working through the nights after her nursing shifts on the kitchen table, with a knife and rubber strips and the 1987 manual open beside her. What she began to understand, more concretely than she had before, was that someone trained to value what she had could see it clearly. The problem was not that the value was absent. The problem was that the measuring instrument most people carried could not detect it. Then came the summer of 2019. The summer of 2019 arrived in Calhoun County on a particular schedule that anyone who farms on that ridge still talks about. June was wet. July turned hot and dry, and then the heat stayed. By August 12th, the county had recorded 11 days above 96 degrees. The relative humidity ran high. Those conditions, sustained, created the specific environment that Erwinia amylivora, the bacterium that causes fire blight in palm fruits, requires to spread from pruning wound to pruning wound and from flower cluster to flower cluster with the efficiency of a burn across dry grass. Fire blight had been present in the county, as it is present everywhere. In the summer of 2019, it ran hard. High-density dwarf plantings are particularly susceptible to fire blight. The same characteristics that make them productive vigorous shoot growth and dense canopy, and the responsive pressure of a trellis-trained tree pushing against its neighbors are the characteristics that fire blight exploits. The bacterium enters through actively growing tissue and vigorously growing dwarf trees on wire, pushing hard under the stimulus of irrigation and competition, produce that tissue all summer. When blight strikes those trees, it moves fast. Gus Farrell lost 60% of his Harrow sweet block by mid-September. Not 60% of the fruit, 60% of the trees, the wood, the investment, the trellis they were tied to. The blight struck down through the scaffolds into the leaders and the rootstocks, and once it reached the graft union of a semi-dwarf tree, there was nothing to do but cut the tree out and burn it. He lost the Moonglow block less severely, about 30%. His buyer at the packing house reduced contract tonnage for the following 2 seasons while he replanted, and the replanting cost him another $41,000 he did not have. He did not lose his farm. He came close, and the winter of 2019 was a hard one for him and his wife, sitting at their kitchen table going over figures that would not balance. Nora lost 4 trees in 2019. One was a volunteer rootstock she had not been monitoring closely. One was a September queen she had been worried about since 2017. She lost blighted wood on the tips of perhaps a third of the remaining trees, cut it back hard in the dry heat of late September with sterilized tools, sealed the cuts, and treated the whole orchard with a copper hydroxide spray she had been rotating with other controls since 2013, following a disease management protocol she had assembled from Ruth's notebooks and the 1987 propagation manual and 2 academic extension bulletins she had found through a library database. The difference between those 2 outcomes was not luck, and it was not simply a matter of variety choice. Ruth Vance's notebooks contained, across 4 decades of observation, a record of every fire blight outbreak that had touched the Calhoun County Ridge going back to 1963. Ruth had noted the conditions that preceded each one: heat accumulation above 90 degrees combined with wet spring followed by dry early summer, the specific week when blossoms first showed, the timing of her copper applications relative to petal fall. She had documented which trees showed tip blight versus which showed rootstock infection, and she had noted the years when a particular application schedule had held the infection to 2 or 3 trees and the years when she had been late and paid for it. She had not known, writing those entries in her careful, small hand, that she was building a disease model. She was writing down what she saw. But what she had built, notebook by notebook across 40 years, was a local disease record more granular than anything the county extension office maintained. Nora had read every entry. She had assembled a spray calendar from Ruth's observations that was calibrated not to the general recommendations on an extension fact sheet, but to the specific disease pressure history of a 2-acre orchard on a particular ridge in Calhoun County, West Virginia. She had applied her first copper rotation 7 days earlier in the spring of 2019 than the extension recommendation called for, because Ruth's notebook showed that in high rainfall Junes, the infection window on this ridge opened before the standard petal fall timing assumed. She did not know this was correct until September, when she counted 4 lost trees against Gus Farrell's figures. In the winter that followed, Nora sat at the kitchen table with the notebooks open and went back through every fire blight entry Ruth had made from 1963 forward, cross-referencing the spray timing she had used in 2019 against the timing Ruth had documented in the high-pressure seasons of 1974, 1987, and 1998. The pattern held, early rotation in wet June years. The ridge ran its own schedule, slightly ahead of the county average because the orchard faced east and warmed early and the blossom set came a few days before the low ground. Ruth had known this the way she knew which trees needed summer pruning and which punished it. She had not written it down as a principle. She had written it down as what happened year by year. Nora drove to the extension office in January to file a formal report on her 2019 blight incidents. She was not going to make a point. She thought the local data might be useful to someone. She brought a typed summary of her spray calendar and a one-page explanation of its derivation from the notebooks. The staff member who received it was pleasant and thanked her and said the information would be forwarded to the appropriate program. Nora drove home. That same winter, she went for the first time to a regional heritage variety conference in Morgantown. She had seen the announcement in a newsletter June Mast had forwarded her and decided it was worth the drive. She brought 12 grafted whips in 5-gallon buckets in the bed of her truck and the 11 notebooks in a canvas bag and a half-dozen jars of September Queen and iron pear preserves, and she set up at a folding table in the conference hall. A pomologist named Iris Cho, who was 38 years old and worked for a university extension program in Ithaca, New York, stopped at the table in the second hour of the afternoon session, picked up a jar of September Queen preserves, and read the handwritten label Nora had put on it. She asked where the variety came from. That conversation ran 2 hours and spilled into the hallway, past the time the building's lights were supposed to be turned off. Iris tasted every preserve Nora had brought. She asked to look at the notebooks. She sat with the third one open for 20 minutes, reading Ruth's Bricks entries for the iron pear, and she was quiet with a stillness that Nora would later describe as the way a doctor looks at a scan they had not expected to see. "Where else does this variety exist?" Iris said. Nora said she did not know of anywhere else. Iris said she would like to visit the orchard in the spring. She visited in May of 2020, arriving on a Thursday with her own refractometer and a camera and a field notebook. She spent 2 full days walking the orchard with Nora, tasting fruit from cold storage, taking bark samples, and cross-referencing every tree against the heritage Pear databases she had access to on her laptop in the evenings at the farmhouse. Hatch approved of her by the second morning, which Nora noted as a favorable indicator. On the second evening, Iris sat at the kitchen table and told Nora carefully and precisely that the iron pear did not appear in the Pyrus communis variety collection she had surveyed, that it was distinct enough in its late-ripening phenology and its flesh chemistry that it warranted investigation as a potentially unregistered variety, and that the September Queen showed similar markers. She asked Nora whether she would be willing to contribute cyan wood to the USDA Plant Genetic Resources Collection at Geneva, New York, for preservation, and whether she would consider a grafting partnership with Iris's program for research purposes. Nora said yes to both. The work that followed across 2020 and 2021 was the kind of work that does not make noise while it happens. Nora grafted through the winters on the kitchen table. She distributed young trees to small growers and research programs. She met through Iris and through the conference circuit, charging $22 per whip to cover her costs and nothing beyond. She was still running her nursing shifts, still working the orchard on evenings and weekends, still taking Hatch on the morning walk through the rows that Ruth had walked with her own dog 40 years before. The orchard looked the same from the road. Gus Farrell was still replanting. He had gotten through the worst of it. He had taken the extension program's advice on blight-resistant rootstocks for the new planting and hoped for better luck with the weather. At the regional meeting in Morgantown in 2021, Iris presented preliminary data from the first season of trials on the September Queen and the Iron Pear at the Ithaca Research Station. She had grafted 30 trees of each onto 3 rootstock types and was tracking blight incidence, yield, and bricks. The September Queen had produced its first meaningful crop in year 2, which was unusually early for a full-size pear on semi-dwarf rootstock. Its blight incidence across a moderate pressure season had been low. The Iron Pear was slower to establish, as late-ripening varieties often are, but the first fruit samples had confirmed Ruth's bricks readings from the notebooks. Nora sat in the back of the room during that presentation and listened to Iris describe her mother's trees in the language of a peer-reviewed journal. She did not raise her hand. She had a cup of coffee and her canvas bag and the hatch waiting in the truck in the parking lot. The fall of 2023 was when the evaluation concluded. Iris Cho's team, working in partnership with a USDA pomologist named Raymond Sell, completed the preliminary morphological and genetic work on the September Queen and the Iron Pear that autumn. Raymond drove down from Geneva and spent the morning in Nora's kitchen with 2 bowls of fruit and his tasting notes, quiet for a long time after each sample. He was a careful man and specific with his language. He said that the September Queen appeared to have no registered match in the variety database. He said the program was treating it as a distinct cultivar pending formal registration. He set the paper down and looked out the window at the orchard on the slope. The figures he had read from that paper did not leave the room quietly. The September Queen had averaged 17.4 bricks across 2 seasons of evaluation, which placed it in the top tier of fresh-eating late pears by that standard. Its fire blight resistance rating across the 2021 high-pressure season was among the highest Iris's program had recorded in any variety in the Eastern Trial Network. And the Iron Pear, measured at first frost on the November 4th harvest, had read 21.8 bricks. 21.8. That is sweeter than a Comus at its best. It is sweeter than most dessert pears on the commercial market. From a fruit that a trained extension horticulturist had advised its keeper to bulldoze along with the trees that bore it. Raymond set the paper down and looked at the orchard for a long time. Nora poured more coffee. Raymond asked if he could walk the orchard again before he drove back to Geneva. He walked it for an hour in the October afternoon light, moving slowly between the trees, stopping at the September Queen near the upper fence line. Hatch went with him, as Hatch went with everyone who walked the orchard with sufficient patience. When Raymond came back to the truck, he said that in his 31 years of evaluating heritage varieties in the eastern U.S., he had not often walked an orchard where he felt certain that something worth losing had been kept. He said it plainly. He did not dress it up. Nora thanked him for the drive. Gus Farrell called that November. He had heard, through the county orchardist's informal network, that the university had been up at the Vance place. He did not call to ask for anything specific. He called the way a neighbor calls when he has been thinking about something for a while and has decided to stop thinking about it privately. He said he had been wondering whether Nora would ever consider grafting him a few September Queens. He said he understood if the answer was no, that she had a waiting list, and that his operation had been the kind that the Extension Service recommended. He did not say more than that. Nora told him she would put him on the list. He said he was grateful. They talked for a few more minutes about the November weather and the deer pressure on the ridge, and then said goodnight. Nora put the phone down and sat with her coffee. She did not think there was anything unusual about the call. It was just a neighbor asking a neighbor a question after a long time. Dale Pruitt reached out 3 months later through a colleague at the Extension office. He did not call directly at first. He sent a message through the colleague asking whether Nora would be willing to meet and discuss her disease management approach and the variety documentation work, and whether the extension program might be of any help with the formal registration process. He said, in the message as it was relayed to Nora, that he thought there were things to learn from what she had been doing and that he had not understood, 14 years prior, what the orchard represented. Nora said she would be glad to have him visit in the spring. He came in April of 2024, on a morning when the bridal pair was in full blossom. The same white university truck came up the same lane. Hatch met it at the gate with the same level of attention, and this time was satisfied sooner, perhaps reading something in the man's bearing that had changed from the man who had walked the orchard with a clipboard in the 2009. Dale did not carry a clipboard this time. He brought a plain notebook, the kind from any drugstore, and he wrote in it steadily across the 2 hours they walked together. He asked about the spray timing and the disease calendar, and how Nora had derived it from Ruth's records. He asked about the grafting takes and the rootstock sources and the technique adjustments she had made across 14 years. He asked about the bricks methodology and the cold storage protocol that let the iron pear finish its ripening off the tree. He asked about the 11 notebooks and whether they had been digitized. Nora said they had not yet. She said she had been meaning to do it. He said he would like to help with that project if she was willing. He said a disease record that long and that granular, from a single site, was the kind of observational data his program had never had access to, and that it might be useful not only for the variety registration work, but for the county's disease management guidance more broadly. She told him she would think about it. He thanked her at the truck and drove back down the lane, and Nora watched him go and then walked the orchard once more in the April afternoon, moving through the rows in the way she had moved through them for 14 years, checking the new growth on the September Queen's scaffold repairs and the blossom set on the iron pear and the bridal pear in full white cloud against the sky. Hatch went ahead of her and doubled back, as he always did. The 912 grafted trees that Nora had distributed by that point were in the ground now across 11 states. 11 of those placements were at university trial stations. 4 were at orchards that had signed preliminary commercial production agreements, contingent on the September Queen's formal variety registration, which Iris Cho's program expected to complete within the following 2 years. The remaining trees were growing in small orchards and on homestead hillsides and in the genetic conservation collection at Geneva, where scion cuttings of both the September Queen and the iron pear now existed in cold storage as permanent insurance against the loss of any single living tree. Ruth Vance's 11 notebooks were scanned the following winter by a graduate student from the WVU Extension program who spent 3 days at the farmhouse kitchen table photographing every page. A digital copy went to the university archive. A second copy went to Iris Cho's program in Ithaca. The physical originals, the composition books in their cracked covers with Ruth's careful pencil entries and Nora's annotations in the margins, stayed on the shelf above the kitchen table, where they had always been, where Nora could reach for them without getting up. Nora's nephew, Cale, a 24-year-old who worked in commercial real estate in Charleston and had driven out in September of 2021, asking careful, skeptical questions about whether there was anything worth doing with the old orchard, spent an increasing amount of time at the farm across the following 2 years. He had arrived that first visit with the honest assumption that his aunt was engaged in nostalgia, in the keeping of something past its practical usefulness. He had left that first visit with a jar of iron pear butter and a question he could not quite put down. By 2023, he was spending 3 weekends a month on the ridge, learning the orchard row by row, learning the grafting work from Nora the way Nora had learned it from Earl Dodd, by watching first and then doing it himself with supervision. He had the patience for the knife work, which not everyone does. His takes in his first winter were 40%. By his second winter, they were approaching 60, which Nora told him was ahead of where she had been. Last October, he spent a full weekend in the lean-to with a knife and a bag of budding strips and a cooler full of rootstock, grafting September queens for a batch of whips destined for an agricultural college in Pennsylvania that had requested 30 trees for a new heritage variety trial block. Nora came through the lean-to in the late afternoon and watched him work 3 trees without a word, and then corrected a small error in the alignment of his 4th cut. She showed him the cambium layer, the thin green line under the bark, where the union had to meet cleanly. And he looked at it and said he understood, and she could see from the next cut that he did. She handed him the notebook at the end of that day. Not a photocopy, not a scan on a tablet. Ruth's first composition book, the one that runs from 1963 to 1972, the years of the original planting and the first fruiting, and the first fire blight outbreak on the ridge and the first recovery, the years when Ruth was learning what Nora would later learn in turn. The cover is worn through at the corners. The handwriting inside is Ruth's, careful and small, with pencil annotations in Nora's hand from the weeks after the funeral, when she walked the orchard tree by tree and matched the observations to what she found. Kyle held it for a long time before he put it in his bag to take home. He drove back to Charleston with it on the passenger seat. He called 2 days later to ask about the notation system Ruth used for the bricks readings, whether the number she wrote beside the date was taken at harvest or after storage. Nora told him it depended on the year, that Ruth noted which in the margin, and to look at the margin. He said he had already looked and thought he understood, but wanted to be sure. Nora said that was the right instinct. There are 2 kinds of knowledge, and they have always coexisted uneasily on the American land. One kind is wide and current and credentialed, built from data aggregated across thousands of sites and tested against broad averages and reproduced in fact sheets and variety catalogs. It is not wrong. It is genuinely useful. It describes what land of a given type tends to do under a given set of conditions, and the people who carry it are sincere and often careful and doing their honest best with the tools their training gave them. This is not a story about villains. The other kind is narrow and specific and local, accumulated across seasons and generations in a single place by people paying close attention to what the land in front of them actually does, not what a fact sheet says it should do. It is held in composition notebooks and in the hands of people who have grafted 500 times and can feel a proper cambium alignment before they see it. It cannot be aggregated. It cannot be averaged across 11 counties. It is worth almost nothing to a general-purpose database and almost everything to the particular acre it knows. When the structural shock comes, the kind of heat and humidity and disease pressure that exposes the hidden cost of building for efficiency in a world that does not cooperate, this is the knowledge that holds. A woman kept her mother's trees. She did not do it because she believed she would be proven right. She did it because she could not read her mother's handwriting in those notebooks without understanding that there was something in that orchard worth keeping, and that if she did not keep it, no one would. She kept it through 14 years of nursing shifts and winter grafting and September harvests, through the 4 trees she lost in 2019 and the recovery that followed, through the first hesitant conversations at conference tables and the pomologist from Geneva walking her rows with quiet purpose. She kept it without vindication for years before vindication came. The September queen is in fruit every other year. Nora picks it alone mostly, sometimes with Cale, in the long light of late September on the Calhoun County Ridge. The iron pear is still on the tree in October, finishing slow, the way it has always finished. What the spreadsheet cannot count is not the same as what does not exist.